The morning it happened, he was just a tall guy in a faded jacket standing outside a coffee shop on Clarendon Street, holding a paper cup with both hands the way people do when it's cold and the coffee is the only warm thing they've got. He wasn't supposed to be in Boston at all. He'd flown in from Sydney 2 days earlier, not for a premiere, not for a press junket, not for anything that would have his name in a headline. He was there because a friend who ran a small wellness company on the South End had called him 3 weeks ago and said, "I need someone who actually knows what they're doing to look at what we've built before we sign anything." And Chris had said yes, the way he usually said yes to things that didn't require him to be famous, quietly, without fuss, on the next available flight. He hadn't told anyone he was coming. He never did. He was wearing the jacket he always wore when he traveled without a team. Navy cotton, washed so many times the collar had gone soft. Jeans. Boots that had seen actual mud, not just acidy pavement. A cap pulled low. He was 6'3" and built like something that had been put together for a purpose. And even in that jacket, even with the cap, there was a quality to him that made people look twice. Not because they recognized him, most didn't, but because he moved the way people move when they are completely comfortable taking up space in the world. Easy, unhurried, like a man who had learned stillness from a place that had a lot of it. He'd grown up with that kind of stillness, Bowman, Northern Territory. Red earth and eucalyptus, and the particular silence of the Australian outback that gets inside you when you're a child and never entirely leaves. He'd learned to read what a place was telling you before it told you directly. The way cattle moved before weather came, the way water in a still creek told you something about what was upstream. You didn't learn that in a classroom. You learned it by paying attention for a long time in a place where inattention had consequences. He was paying attention now. He'd been watching the corner of Clarendon and St. James for no particular reason. The way you watch a street corner when you're drinking coffee and have nowhere urgent to be. When the black-stretched limousine came around the turn too fast for the wet road and caught the wide puddle at the base of the curb. The water went up like a curtain. He saw it happen in the particular slow-motion way the brain records things it wasn't expecting. The woman on the sidewalk, young, dark uniform, bag pulled close to her side, walking with her head angled against the wind, had no time to step back. The water hit her from the knee down, solid and gray and cold, and soaked through everything. She stopped walking. The limousine stopped too, about 15 feet past her, which made him think for a half second that someone inside had seen it. But the door opened because it was always going to open. This was the drop-off point for the Clarendon Grand, the 5-star hotel on the corner. The car had simply arrived. The woman who stepped out wore a cream-colored coat that probably cost more than the woman on the sidewalk made in 2 months. She had the kind of posture that comes from a childhood spent being watched, chin up, eyes already moving to the next thing that might disappoint her. Somewhere in her late 30s. The particular ease of someone who had never had to hurry for anything, ever. She looked at the woman standing there on the sidewalk, wet to the knee. 2 seconds. Maybe less. "You should watch where you stand, sweetheart," she said, and walked into the hotel. No heat in it, no malice exactly. Just the flat efficiency of someone who had already filed the moment under irrelevant and moved on. The limousine driver pulled away without looking back. Chris stood on the opposite corner with his paper cup and watched the woman on the sidewalk absorb what had just happened. She didn't say anything. She didn't look after the limousine. She reached into her bag, found a small towel, the kind you keep for exactly the kind of emergency that shouldn't keep happening but does, and blotted what she could. Then she straightened her blazer, picked up her bag, and walked through the service entrance of the Clarendon Grand like she had a job to do, which she did. He stood there for a moment after she was gone. Then he dropped his cup in the bin beside the coffee shop door, turned up his collar against the wind, and walked in the same direction. He pushed through the main entrance of the Clarendon Grand at 7:42 on a Tuesday morning and asked the young man at the front desk for a standard room 2 nights. Cash if possible. The young man, name badge said Marcus, 24 years old, the kind of focused professionalism you can see in someone who earned their position rather than inherited it, processed the request without visible surprise, which Chris appreciated. He'd learned to notice the people who treated everyone the same, regardless of what they looked like. It was rarer than it should have been. He took his bag to the 14th floor, didn't unpack, sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the ceiling for a while, the way he did in hotel rooms, not thinking about anything specific, just letting the place tell him what it was. Then he went back downstairs. He always learned more downstairs. Her name was Nora Hayes, though he didn't know that yet. 26. She'd changed into a dry backup uniform in the staff bathroom and was at the concierge desk 3 minutes ahead of the morning briefing because she was the kind of person who was always 3 minutes ahead and didn't think about it as a virtue. It was just the shape of how she moved through the world. She had been at the Clarendon Grand for 14 months, which was longer than she'd been anywhere, since she left New Hampshire at 22, with a hospitality management degree from a state school she'd paid for herself, through a sequence of jobs so varied she sometimes had trouble keeping them straight in the right order. Waitress, airport shuttle driver, housekeeping supervisor at a ski resort in Vermont, night auditor at a mid-range chain in Portsmouth at $14.75 an hour. Each one had taught her something. She kept all of it. She was good at her job the way certain people are good at things they taught themselves, not with the ease of natural talent, but with the permanent edge of someone who earned every piece of it and knows exactly what it cost. Her left shoe was still making a faint sound when she shifted her weight. She'd packed the inside with paper towels. It wasn't elegant. It worked. He found her at the concierge desk at around 9 o'clock, when she was in the middle of handling a room request for a guest with a specific mobility concern. He waited. She finished what she was doing, fully, properly, without rushing it, and then turned to him. "Hi, how can I help?" "I'm looking for somewhere to walk," he said. "Near water, not the tourist version." She thought for a moment. He could see her actually thinking, not reaching for the standard answer. "The Esplanade is your best option. Go past the hatch shell, keep going north. There's a stretch past the footbridge where it opens out. It won't be on any map the hotel gives you." "How far?" 15 minutes. 20 if the rain picks up again. He glanced at the lobby windows. The sky outside was the color of wet concrete. "Worth it?" "The Esplanade in the rain," she said, "is better than most places in the sun." He looked at her for a moment. Something in the way she said it, the specificity of the opinion, the lack of any performance in it, landed differently than most things did. He nodded. "Thank you, Nora," he said, reading her badge, and walked toward the main entrance. She watched him go and noticed that he'd used her name. Most guests didn't. The ones who did, you held on to. He came back 3 hours later, wet through the jacket, the boots darker at the toe from the path by the water's edge. He walked past the concierge desk, she was with someone, and caught her eye and gave her a single nod that said the Esplanade had been exactly what she'd said it would be. She found herself smiling before she knew she was doing it. Marcus, from the front desk, watched the exchange and said nothing, and filed it the way good people file things, quietly, for later. What Chris had done on the Esplanade, for 3 hours in the cold and the rain, was walk. Not for exercise, though he was the kind of man for whom moving through the world on foot in difficult weather was simply normal. The Outback didn't raise people who needed sunshine to function, but to think. He thought about what he'd seen on Clarendon Street. He thought about the woman with the towel in her bag. He thought about a particular quality he recognized in how she stood on that sidewalk, the absolute refusal to make the moment any larger than it needed to be. Absorb it. Move forward. Do the job. He had known that quality in one other person clearly, his mum. She had cleaned hotels. In Melbourne first, when he was small, then in Brisbane, and finally in Byron Bay, where they'd settled when he was 8. She had been a housekeeper who became a floor supervisor through 14 years of exactly that quality, absorbing, moving forward, doing the job. She'd been good at it in a way that people who are good at things don't usually announce. She could walk into a room that had been wrecked by guests who thought someone else would fix it, and she'd look at it once, the whole thing, and then she'd start in the corner and work forward with a calmness that Chris had eventually understood was not the absence of feeling, but the management of it. She'd lost the job in 2003 when he was 19. A restructuring, they'd called it. 6 minutes in an office with a man who was 20 years younger than she was and had never cleaned a room in his life. 2 weeks severance. A handshake that she didn't take because she'd had a premonition. She told him this later, that if she shook his hand, she might say something she couldn't take back. She went home that afternoon and sat at the kitchen table and wrote a list, not of grievances, of everything she knew, every system she'd figured out, every small fix she'd invented, every piece of expertise that 14 years had built. She wrote it in a blue Spirax notebook, the cheap kind with the red spine, and she filled 43 pages. Chris still had that notebook. It lived in the inside pocket of whatever bag he was traveling with. Not as a keepsake, not for sentiment, but because it was the most concentrated document of practical human intelligence he had ever encountered, and he had encountered quite a lot of practical human intelligence in his life. The notebook reminded him of something he'd come to believe as firmly as anything, that the most capable people in any operation are almost never the ones whose names are on the building. They are the ones who show up early, the ones who carry spare towels, the ones who can read a room before they're in it and have already solved the problem before anyone else has named it. He walked back from the esplanade in the rain with that thought sitting squarely in the front of his mind. And when he came in through the main entrance of the Clarendon Grand and gave Nora Hayes that nod across the lobby, what he was thinking was, she's carrying a list too. She just doesn't know it yet. He didn't know yet how soon things were going to get worse before they got better. He found out that same afternoon. At 4:30, he was in the hotel gym, not the main one that guests used, but the small staff access facility on the third floor that he'd found by accident the previous day, because he always found the rooms that weren't on the map. He was working through the kind of training session that he'd maintained for years now. The center, methodology he'd built with his team, the specific combination of functional movement and breath work and weighted conditioning that kept him at a level of physical capability that still occasionally surprised the stunt coordinators who'd worked with him across a decade of film work. He was mid-set when his phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. It said, "Something's happening at the concierge desk. Thought you should know. From the front desk I can see Miss Ashford's assistant spoke to Mr. Sloan this afternoon." He set the weight down slowly. Derek Sloan was the general manager of the Clarendon Grand. Chris had seen the nameplate, had done a quick search on the walk back from the esplanade. 51. Gray at the temples. The kind of manager who kept his suits one size too small in the shoulders, which gave him the permanent appearance of a man about to say something he'd already decided you weren't going to like. He went upstairs and changed in 4 minutes, which was about as long as it took him, and came back down to find Nora emerging from the corridor that led to the management offices with the particular stillness of someone trying very hard not to let anything show. He was at the end of the corridor. She looked at him. "I'm fine," she said. "Okay," he said. They stood there for a moment. Somewhere above them, a housekeeping cart went past, its wheels loud on the hard floor. "Do you like your job?" he asked. It wasn't an intrusive question the way he asked it. It was the way you ask something when you're genuinely curious and you think the answer might matter. She thought about it. "I'm good at it," she said. "That's not the same thing." "No," she said. "It isn't." He nodded. He'd heard that distinction before. "I'm sorry about this morning," he said. "On the sidewalk, that wasn't right." She looked at him more carefully. "You were across the street." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. "It happens," she said. "Puddles and people. That's just cities." "You walked straight in and did your job," he said. "Wet shoes and everything. What else would I do? It wasn't a question." He understood that. It was a statement about the shape of her life, and he recognized it, because his mom had said something almost word for word identical to him once, when he was about 15, and had asked why she didn't complain more. "I'm Chris," he said, and put out his hand. "Nora," she said, and shook it. He went to the lobby. She went back to work. Neither of them knew the night still had one more move to make. But here's the part that matters. Because what he didn't know yet, what neither of them knew yet, was that Victoria Ashford had already made a phone call, and that phone call had already set something in motion that Nora couldn't see coming. Victoria Ashford came down from the penthouse at 6:15 that evening in a dress that had no business being outside in November, and walked through the lobby toward the Ashbury Bar at the east end of the building, where she had arranged to meet 3 women she knew from the charity circuit. Her assistant had called ahead to ensure the corner booth was reserved. It was. The Clarendon Grand was good at anticipating. What Nora didn't observe, because she was handling a late check-in at the desk, was Chris settling into the armchair nearest the lobby fireplace with a glass of water and a paperback that looked like it had been read at least 4 times. She didn't observe him watching the lobby for the better part of an hour. The way the bar staff moved around Victoria's table, the way the shift change happened at the front desk, was small behaviors that told you what a place actually was when it wasn't performing. He watched Nora most of all, not in any way that would concern anyone. In the way you watch someone work when you're trying to understand what they're actually doing. She had a quality of stillness at the desk that he had taken a while to name correctly because it looked, from the outside, like calm. But it wasn't calm. It was attention, wide, distributed, tracking 4 things simultaneously without appearing to track any of them. She would solve a problem for the guest in front of her while registering the couple near the elevator who looked uncertain, while noting the slight change in the lobby's ambient tone that meant someone significant was arriving. He had built an entire wellness platform on the idea that the body and the mind were not separate systems, that what looked like effortless performance was always the product of layered, disciplined preparation. He knew what that looked like from the inside. He was looking at it now, in a woman who had no idea anyone was watching. His phone rang. Richard Fenton, his development partner in Sydney, calling about something in Brisbane that had nothing to do with Boston. Chris stepped outside to take it. He stood under the awning of the private entrance and talked for a few minutes, and when he came back through the main doors, 8:47 p.m. By the clock above the reception, the lobby had changed shape. The change was this: Derek Sloan was standing at the concierge desk. Victoria Ashford was beside him. Nora was on the other side of the desk. The bar had apparently ended early, or this had been the plan all along, and Marcus, at the front desk 12 feet away, was studying his screen with the concentrated stillness of someone who was very deliberately not looking at what was happening 12 feet to his left. Chris stood near the entrance and didn't move for a moment. He could hear the texture of it from 20 feet away, even if he couldn't hear the specific words. Derek's posture, the posture of a man managing a situation, contained, oriented entirely toward the guest. Victoria's posture, the posture of a woman who had decided that something needed to happen and was waiting for it to happen. Nora's posture, perfectly still, perfectly upright, giving the room absolutely nothing to use. He started walking. He walked the way he walked when he wasn't making a conscious effort to take up less space, which wasn't a performance, just a decision he'd stopped making. He stopped beside the concierge desk. "Sorry to interrupt," he said pleasantly. Derek looked up. He saw a tall man in a plain jacket. He processed the variables, existing guest complaint situation, uninvited audience, and chose to address the audience first. "Sir, if we could just have a moment." "I only need a second," Chris said. "I wanted to ask Nora something." He turned to Derek directly. "Actually, what's the nature of the complaint? The one that's been filed?" Derek blinked. "I'm sorry?" "The complaint Ms. Ashford's raised. I'd like to understand what it's about." Victoria's head turned toward him with a new quality of attention. "Who are you?" "A guest," he said. "I've had good experiences at this desk. I'd like to understand what's being discussed." "This is a private matter," Victoria said. "I understand," he said, equally pleasant. He turned back to Derek. "The woman I watched walk into your hotel this morning, wet through because a car caught a puddle on Clarendon Street at about 10 to 7. She came in through the service entrance, changed into a dry uniform, and was at her post 3 minutes ahead of the briefing. Her last performance score was 94 out of 100, which I understand is the highest on the concierge floor." He paused. "Is she the staff member you're discussing right now?" A pause. The lobby held its breath. "You were on the street this morning," Derek said carefully. "I was getting coffee, across from the service entrance." Victoria Ashford's expression had shifted into something more careful than the version she usually wore. "The complaint that was filed," Chris continued, and his voice had moved slightly into a register that was still quiet but had a different weight to it, the weight of someone who has decided something. Was it filed because of attentiveness, or because of the fact that this employee was present this morning when a guest chose not to acknowledge something that happened on a public sidewalk? The ambient noise of the lobby had settled. The couple near the fireplace were no longer looking at their phones. Derek said, "I think there may have been some miscommunication." "I'd like to see the complaint file," Chris said. and I need to make one call. He took out his phone. He didn't perform it. He just took it out and called a number. Hey, he said when it picked up. It's Chris. I'm at the Boston property. Yeah, downstairs. I need you to send through my investment documentation to the GM here, Derek Sloan. Full stake summary, the wellness partnership terms, the operations review clause. Tonight. A pause. Cheers. He put the phone back in his pocket. Derek Sloan's face moved through several expressions in the span of about 10 seconds. He landed, Chris observed, on understanding. Victoria was very still. I don't understand, she said, and it was the first entirely honest thing she'd said in the last 15 minutes. I have a stake in this property, Chris said. I'm here as a guest this week because I prefer to see how places actually function, rather than read reports about them. He looked at her directly. What I've seen today is a staff member handle an unfair situation with more professionalism than it deserved, and then be called to a manager's office because a complaint was filed about something that had nothing to do with her job. He let that sit for a moment. I saw what happened on Clarendon Street this morning, he said. I know the car wasn't yours, but what happened afterward, that was a choice. He said it without heat, without anger, the same way his mom had said things she meant, simply and without decoration. That's your business. But this, a slight gesture toward the space between them and the desk, this is mine. A long silence. Victoria looked at Nora. She looked at her for longer than she'd looked at anyone in the past 3 days. Nora stood without moving, without expression, without any of the visible relief that would have been entirely reasonable. I owe you an apology, Victoria said finally. The words came out with the stiffness of something that was unaccustomed but genuine. Not rehearsed, not PR written, not hollow. This morning. That was wrong. Thank you, Nora said. Not warm, not cold, exactly what it was. Victoria walked to the elevator. Her assistant materialized from somewhere and followed. Derek Sloan stood at the desk for a moment longer. He looked at Nora and then at Chris, and then he said, I'll need to revisit the schedule adjustment from this afternoon. Yes, Chris said. I think you will. He said it the way he said most things that mattered, without emphasis, because the weight was already there, and it didn't need his voice to carry it. Derek left. The lobby breathed again. The fire crackled. A couple near the entrance resumed discussing their dinner plans. You didn't have to do that, Nora said. I know. I've handled things like this before. I know that, too. She looked at him with the same quality of attention she brought to the desk, wide, careful, figuring out whether to trust what was in front of her. What are you, actually? He thought for a moment about the cleanest way to answer that. I'm an actor mostly, he said. Australian. I have some investments in wellness and property and a few other things. I try to check in on them in person when I can. She processed this. An actor. Occasionally people recognize me, he said. Most people don't, when I'm not dressed for it. She looked at him, really looked, the way she looked at things when she was reading a room, and then something shifted in her face. Thor, she said. He smiled. It was a good smile, the kind that reached without announcing itself. That would be one way to put it. And you're staying in a standard room on the 14th floor. I always book the standard room, he said. You see more from a standard room. She was quiet for a moment. That's either very humble or very strange. My mom would say both, he said. They stood there for a moment in the warm lobby, the fireplace ticking, the hotel moving quietly around them. Can I ask you something? He said. Go ahead. If you could do any version of this work, the hospitality, the management side of it, what would it look like? She thought about it seriously, which he had expected she would. I'd want to run a smaller property, she said. Something specific, where you actually know what's happening in every room, every shift. Not a place that's performing luxury, a place that actually delivers it. There's a difference. There is, he said. I've been saving for a management course, she said. It's slow, but it's moving. He nodded. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, I have a colleague who runs a boutique wellness retreat in Maine, small property, 20 rooms, serious about what it does. She's been looking for someone to take the front-of-house management role. I'd like to put your name forward if you're interested. No obligation. Just a conversation. The offer sat between them. Neither of them rushed it. Why? She said. Because the Esplanade in the rain is better than most places in the sun, he said. And only someone who actually knows a place tells you that. She looked at him for a long time. All right, she said. Send me the information. He nodded. She had a guest to attend to. He picked up his paperback from the armchair by the fireplace and went upstairs. And that, you might think, is where the story ends. But what happened next? That's the part that mattered most. The investigation that followed was not loud. Loud investigations rarely find the things that actually need finding. The operations team from the investor group came in quietly 3 days after that evening, and they simply asked questions and listened to the answers. What they found had a pattern to it that a single complaint couldn't show. A banquet manager named Craig Whitfield had been moved from conference events to a back-office logistics role in February of the previous year after a complaint from a corporate client during a gala event. The official record cited a service coordinating failure. What had actually happened? Craig had set up the room exactly as the venue manager instructed him to. The venue manager had provided the wrong instructions. The client who filed the complaint had left the gala before the failure she described had occurred. Craig was 39, 16 years in hospitality, a mortgage in Somerville, and a daughter starting college in September. He had not contested the decision. He had simply moved to the smaller role and kept his head down and done the work. Because that was what you did when the alternative was losing everything. A server named Paula Halston had been publicly reprimanded by Derek Sloan personally during a private dining service in the Whitmore room on a Thursday evening in October, reprimanded in front of the guests for a plating error that the kitchen supervisor later confirmed had originated entirely with the kitchen, not with Paula. She had said nothing at the time. She had filed nothing afterward. When the investigators asked her why, she said, "Because I knew what happened to people who filed grievances here." She had been watching, she said, for 8 months, waiting for one person to go first. And Paula Halston was not the last name they would write down. And there was Marcus, who had watched a concierge named Diane Calloway. 6 years at the Clarendon Grand, excellent record. Lose her morning shift position after Victoria Ashford filed a complaint about her in March of the previous year. Diane had been moved to overnight housekeeping administration. She'd resigned in May because she had a family and couldn't sustain night shifts. Marcus had said nothing when it happened. He was 24 years old and 2 years into his first real job. And he had understood with the certainty of someone who is young enough to be afraid that saying something would cost him more than staying quiet. The morning after Chris made his phone call, Marcus knocked on the door of the staff room where Nora was reading her documentation on her break. "Can I say something?" he said. "Go ahead." He sat down across from her. "There was a woman before you," he said, "on the morning shift, Diane Calloway. She'd been here 6 years. He paused. "Ms. Ashford complained about her last March. Derek moved her to overnights. She left in May." He looked at his hands. She was really good at her job. "Why are you telling me this now?" Nora asked. "Because someone stood up last night," Marcus said, "and I should have said something a year ago, and I didn't." He met her eyes. "I'm saying it now." That was only the beginning of what Sandra Holt would find. Sandra was the operations director for the investment group, precise, thorough, the kind of person who reads footnotes. Her report, dated November 14th, gave the pattern a name: systematic guest preference bias, resulting in demonstrable staff harm. It was not a dramatic phrase, it was accurate. What happened to Derek Sloan was swift. On November 17th at 3:30 p.m., Sandra Holt and the hotel's HR director sat across from him in his own office for 22 minutes. He was terminated under Section 7(4) of the hotel group's conduct policy. 14 weeks of severance. A mutual separation agreement he signed before 5 p.m. He did not contest it. He cleared his desk that evening, and on his way out through the lobby, he stopped in the doorway for a moment and looked at the space, the fireplace, the concierge desk, the ceiling height. That was exactly right, with the expression of a man seeing something clearly for the first time, now that he was leaving it. The financial consequences for Victoria Ashford arrived in stages, the way real consequences usually do. Her events company, Ashford Social Group, had held a corporate hospitality contract with a financial services firm called Meridian Partners for 11 years, a contract worth $2.3 million annually. It was terminated on November 28th in a letter citing a strategic realignment of vendor relationships. The real reason traveled through the professional networks of Boston's upper tier the way real reasons always do, quietly, between people who had recently learned something they considered relevant to a business decision. 3 other corporate accounts followed within 6 weeks. The combined annual revenue loss to Ashford Social Group came to approximately $1 million. The Boston Harbor Preservation Fund, a charity gala of which Victoria had been honorary chair for 4 consecutive years, did not renew her appointment for the following cycle. The announcement was a single line in the December newsletter. She was not ruined. She was the daughter of a real estate dynasty, and she would be fine, in the material sense. What she lost was quieter than ruin and more lasting. She lost a particular kind of trust that takes a decade to build. The trust of people who watch you in a room to see how you set the tone, to see how you treat the people around you. To see whether the person you are in public is the person you are when you think the moment is disposable. She had spent 10 years building that kind of trust. She'd spent it in 2 seconds on a wet sidewalk on Clarendon Street, on a woman she'd already decided wasn't worth seeing. Nora Hayes heard about the Meridian contract in late February, standing in the lobby of a 20-room wellness retreat on the coast of Maine, where she had been the front-of-house manager for 6 weeks. The retreat was called Outer Reach. It sat on a headland above the Atlantic, surrounded by pine forest, and in February it was extraordinary, cold, stripped back, the kind of beautiful that doesn't ask anything of you except to be present. The guests came for digital detox programs and movement workshops, and the particular silence that you can only find when you've driven 2 hours from the nearest city and given your phone to the front desk. Nora had given hers to herself, and she ran the desk with the same quality of attention she'd brought to the Clarendon Grand, except that here she had room to build something rather than just maintain it, and she had discovered that building was what she was actually for. Chris had come up from Boston to walk the property with her 3 weeks ago. He'd had opinions about the dining room setup and the circulation pattern between the wellness studios and the accommodation wing. She'd had opinions too. They disagreed about the dining room. He thought the tables were too closely spaced for the retreat's philosophy. She thought the intimacy was intentional and correct, and agreed about almost everything else. She stood in the lobby now with her coat still on, because she'd just come in from a morning walk along the headland path, and she was looking at the ceiling the way she'd learned to look at ceilings. It was lower than the Clarendon Grand, maybe 8 inches lower. It made the space feel gathered, held, somehow, like the building was paying attention to the people inside it. She thought about Clarendon Street, the water rising from the curb, the woman in the cream coat who had already moved on before Nora had finished standing still. She thought about the particular way it felt to be invisible in a city, not just unseen, but actively not worth the time it would take to see you. She thought about a tall man in a faded navy jacket standing across the street with a paper cup in both hands, watching. She thought about Marcus saying, "I'm saying it now." She thought about Craig Whitfield in the smaller office, keeping his head down, about Paula Halston waiting 8 months for one person to go for first. What she had come to understand, not on the day it happened, but in the months that accumulated afterward, was that what had changed her life was not being rescued. She had not been rescued, she had been witnessed. And witnessing, she had discovered, was the thing that had been missing all along. Not intervention, not charity, just the fundamental human acknowledgement that what was happening was real, that it mattered, and that someone who had nothing to gain from noticing had stayed long enough to notice. She pulled out her phone and sent a message. "I've been thinking about the dining room. You might be right about the table spacing." The reply came back fast. "Might be?" She smiled. "I said might be. Don't push it. 3 dots then. How's the ceiling?" She looked up. 8 inches lower than the Grand. "It's right," she typed back. "You're just too used to high ceilings." A pause. Then, "Fair." She put the phone in her coat pocket and stood in the lobby of her building and listened to the Atlantic doing what it did in February on the Maine coast, pushing hard against the headland, steady and gray and indifferent to everything except the shape of the shore it was working on. She was 26 years old. She had packed a wet shoe with paper towels and arrived at her briefing 3 minutes early and done her job and kept walking. That morning on Clarendon Street, none of it was visible yet. But then, the most important mornings rarely announce themselves. The truest measure of a person is not what they do when someone powerful is watching. It's what they do when no one is. Nora Hayes had done the same thing in both situations, walked straight in, done the work, held herself with care. The morning on Clarendon Street did not make her into something she wasn't already. It only put light on what was already there. That is the thing about dignity. You don't build it in the extraordinary moments. You build it in the ordinary ones. In the wet shoe you pack with paper towels. In the briefing you arrive to 3 minutes early. In the quiet, genuine attention you bring to a lobby full of people who may never think to look at you. Dignity is not something that can be splashed away. Have you ever had a moment where someone simply saw you? Not to rescue you, not to fix anything, but just to see you. And that was the thing that changed everything. Tell us in the comments. We read every single one. If this story stayed with you, leave a like and share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And subscribe, because the stories that matter most are the quiet ones, and we're just getting started. This is a fictional, dramatized story created for educational and inspirational purposes. All supporting characters, businesses, and events are fictional. Any resemblance to real persons other than Chris Hemsworth is coincidental. Narration is AI-assisted.